Hello and welcome to another episode of RA008 Theology. For this episode, we're delighted to offer up a fascinating interview with philosopher Dr. Evan Fales. Dr. Fales is a philosophy professor emeritus at the University of Iowa. He received his PhD in philosophy at Temple University in 1974, and his primary research interests are epistemology, philosophy of science, metaphysics, and, most relevant to today's discussion, philosophy of religion. I was visiting Iowa City this weekend with a good friend of mine, and Dr. Fales was gracious enough to sit down with me for an interview in his office. It was a great discussion. We covered a wide variety of topics. And so without further delay, here is an interview with Dr. Evan Fales. First, let me ask you, I feel that I can draw a pretty direct line between my current interest in philosophy of religion and my religious upbringing, and I'm wondering if that is the case for you as well. What kind of brought you to an interest in philosophy of religion?
It's very complicated, actually, in my case. Let's see, a thumbnail would be this. My parents were Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, came over here in the spring of 1940. I was born 3 years later. By that point, they had converted to Quakerism, Society of Friends. And so, at least nominally, I was raised a Quaker. What that amounted to really was that it was up to me to find my own way. Right
Sure.
from the start, when I was a little kid. My parents, I think of as Sermon on the Mount Quakers. They didn't preach much, but they practiced. And that had quite a profound influence on me. But we didn't really attend a regular Quaker meeting because where my father got a job after the war, the local meeting was racist. I grew up on a traditionally black college campus. I was kind of occasionally thinking about such matters, but I wasn't really, in any real sense, religious, I would say. By the time I was, I think, 12, I had come to the conclusion that people who are religious are so because they're afraid of death. A theory which I wasn't the first to arrive at, and which it took me maybe 10 years to give up because the data don't support it very well. During high school and college, I decided that the three important disciplines that contained the secrets of the universe were physics, philosophy, and religion. I got mainly interested in physics, was a physics major in college.
Okay.
And
some of the work on causation you've done within philosophy of science.
Yes, which is where I actually wrote my philosophy dissertation.
Okay.
But there was an interlude there before I wound up in graduate school in philosophy. And then something happened that was really kind of had a major influence on me. I got interested in religion while I was in graduate school, but in a kind of accidental way, which had to do with an ethics course I took, which led me to get interested in sort of what the empirical data are with respect to how ethical systems work in different cultures on the ground. And I was interested enough in it that I took 2 graduate courses in anthropology, which required me to read pretty much the canon, late 19th century, 20th century stuff. And there weren't a lot of data on moral systems as such, but what pretty much obsessed the anthropologists during this period was the origins of religion and what explains religion. And I got interested in that, really interested in it, and kind of worked my way through a bunch of the major figures, decided what I thought was wrong and what I thought was right. In the meantime, my best friend was studying religion at Chicago, the School of Religion at Chicago, and he was starting to work on the Gospel of Matthew with a Jewish scholar at Chicago, quite somewhat interesting guy, J.Z. Smith, who was sort of pioneering the use of anthropological methods as applied to the biblical texts. And I saw Daniel after some years, and started to ask him about his work, and this light bulb went on. Oh, you can apply all this anthropological theory to the New Testament? Wow. Okay. So, I was really kind of excited about that. I read the Bible from beginning to end systematically, and I've been interested in that, fascinated in it ever since. Now, that didn't yet get me to philosophy of religion per se. That happened, I think, while I was here. I kind of shifted from philosophy of science through metaphysics, epistemology, and I really like philosophy of religion because it's a crossroads discipline. Where you get to play in the metaphysics sandbox and the epistemology sandbox and the ethics sandbox. So but it was a long sort of journey, and I didn't get into it with really some sort of strong, what should I say, some strong program or set of predispositions.
So everybody knows that the problem of evil is one of the most popular challenges to belief in God, and this idea of the goodness of free will is often used as the kind of go-to explanation, at least with respect to moral evils, those evils which are the result of failings of human persons. Mm-hmm. However, you've argued that even if we grant that moral freedom can go some distance, it doesn't actually solve the problem, and this is because God could have significantly lessened the evils in the world just by making us different kinds of persons. So rather than focus on particular instances of suffering or evil in the world, you actually have focused on the question of the kinds of persons we are in the first place, and how that affects the distribution and severity of evils in the world. And so I'm wondering what kind, could you talk a bit about what you see as the key problems with the kinds of persons we are on a, assuming a theistic worldview, what do you see as the problems with the kinds of persons we are, and what improvements do you think can avoid accusations of being an affront to free will, for example?
Yeah. Well, of course, Christian theists are almost universally on board with the notion that we are flawed creatures, deeply flawed creatures, and so they have, of course, a story to tell about why that is. It's a kind of a difficult story to make sense of in the end, I think.
Yeah.
But
in light of modern science and the larger narrative.
Well, there's that, and there are other difficulties with the view. In fact, one is directly connected to the issues that I was raising, and that is supposing that on the sixth day, as Genesis 1 puts it, God created human beings. And then at the end of the day, he looked at the world of his creation and saw that it was good. So presumably Adam and Eve were created good in the image of God. And they were in intimate communion with God in a paradise. And they screwed up. Why? And of course, the short answer is, well, they had free will.
Yeah.
To which the reply is, yeah, but they were created with a good will.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, and they knew what God wanted of them and what they owed God, and so why did they mess up?
Right. Especially so quickly.
Why didn't they Yeah, it doesn't take much time. Why didn't they freely choose not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And so the question here, and by the way, Hume already worries about this in his dialogues near the end somewhere. But the question is, well, could God have made creatures that perhaps are very much like us, but unlike us, are both free, as free as we are, and far less prone to evil?
Yeah, so a difference in perhaps disposition, aggressiveness.
That's exactly the thought. And I mean, this aggressiveness is not that hard to give some account of in evolutionary terms.
Sure.
But the fact is that amongst our closest evolutionary cousins are the chimpanzees and the bonobos. And the chimpanzees are really quite aggressive just by nature. And the bonobos are far more conciliatory.
Yeah.
They work much harder just by nature at getting along with one another without overt aggression. And a second observation is that, as anybody knows who's had children, they are born with strong predispositions. Some of them are ornery, some of them are really laid back. There's a full gamut, and it doesn't take very long to recognize this about them. It's something that is prior to exposure to the environment, and then of course it interacts with the environment.
Right.
But it's a reasonable guess that the kids that are born with a kind of a naturally friendly, laid-back disposition will more easily be affected by their environment in ways that lead to an adulthood that is marked by kindness and generosity and so on, than the ones that seem to be born with a chip on their shoulder. And we don't for a moment think that the nice people are somehow less free.
Yeah, it's just a matter of disposition. There's no affront to their ability to choose who they are as a person. That's
right. Yeah. Now, I mean, underlying all this is the deep question, what is it to have free will? But whatever account you give of that, it seems to me it needs to remain true to the fact that nice people are not less free than nasty people are. And so God would not in any way have somehow imposed upon our freedom more than he may have anyway, in making us a whole lot nicer. And if he had, things would be a lot better in this world. There'd be a whole lot less suffering.
I was having a dialogue with an individual just about a month ago where we were talking about this very issue, and I made the point where, we can identify these isolated instances of evil, but oftentimes they're not merely isolated instances. They're of a larger systemic issue. So a lot of these large-scale organized evils that we think of, like the Holocaust or genocides in Darfur, a lot of this can come about by way of how easily morally manipulatable we are as persons in certain circumstances, and I think this is also a kind of point in that favor.
That's true. So it's mean, part of what it seems to me is a deep flaw in our character that needn't have been so, is a very surprisingly strong, well, to use a colloquial phrase, herd mentality.
Mm.
It is remarkable how insecure people feel if they somehow get an identity that sets them apart from the crowd. And this has led to, just no end of mischief.
Yeah.
It can be very easily manipulated by demagogues, as we know. And it needn't have been a characteristic of ours. I mean, we may, I think, have been endowed with strong social instincts without this fear of independence of thought.
One objection to this kind of line of argument would be to say, well, with regard to the temperament issue, as you already mentioned, the Darwinian processes by which we have evolved are going to guarantee some large amount of aggression.
I don't know if they would guarantee it, but in fact, that's the way it happened.
Yeah, and with respect to intelligence, if God wanted to use evolution, then of course we might expect that it is going to be a gradual increase in our cognitive capacities. It seems to me like the omnipotence of God does a lot of damage to an objection like that, where God didn't need to use purely natural processes. These kind of tendencies are going to be only naturally discriminatory. And so it seems like that kind of objection wouldn't go very far.
Well, no, I mean, of course, some Christians reject the Darwinian theory of evolution altogether. Some don't. But either way, it is generally true, at least of Orthodox Christians, that they hold roughly to the sort of story you have in Genesis,
mm-hmm.
that we were created the mold of God, pretty good, and then things screwed up, and that's why we are, admittedly, a deeply troubled species. So, evolution aside, it seems as if, from a Christian point of view, God could have stepped in and just seen to it that the creatures he chose to be his worshippers would be ones that were more more worshipful in the full sense of the word.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, the more power you attribute to God and the more knowledge you attribute to God, the harder it is to hold him innocent with respect to why things are in such a dismal state.
Right. In your article in the Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil a few years back, you build an argument around an interesting concept that you call perfect creature.
Right.
So what is a perfect creature?
Yeah, so this is in a way just a natural outcome of pushing this line of thought.
Pushing it further and further. Yeah.
Further and thinking, well, just how good could God make creatures, assuming that he wanted to maximize value in the universe, along these lines. And it struck me that it is really hard to find any sort of argument that forecloses on the possibility that God could create beings that are just exactly like him.
Mm-hmm.
Except for one feature, which is that, of course, trivially, they are created creatures, whereas God is uncreated. But otherwise, they would be
identical,
just like identical twins to God. And wouldn't that be a great world?
Right.
These are creatures that would be as free as God is. And now, by the way, I mean, this is a matter of some controversy among Christian philosophers and theologians. Is God free or isn't he? Mm. I personally happen to have views about freedom of the will which are libertarian, but along which, or a consequence of which are that God is maximally free. And so perfect creatures would be maximally free as well. However, like God, they would necessarily only will and do the very best.
So God is essentially morally perfect, but he's morally free in the sense that he's not held down by any kind of irrational desires or any kind of dispositions.
Yeah, and in fact, I situate myself in a long tradition that tries most fundamentally to understand freedom of the will as a matter of having the capacity to exercise reason, rational choice. In fact, for me, the act of freely deciding just is the act of rationally deliberating.
Okay.
And God is maximal in his ability to do that. He has maximum information. He has, maximum power when it comes to seeing consequences and so on and so forth. And so he's maximally free.
One of the, I think, objections that would pop up into people's minds upon hearing this kind of idea is the kind of threat to the uniqueness of God, right? Where they might raise an issue and say, well, if God creates other all-powerful persons, don't we run a risk of, an immovable object coming up against an unstoppable force, essentially?
Yeah, and the answer is no, because since perfect creatures are perfect, they are of one mind with God when it comes to such questions as what should be done. There could never be a disagreement or a conflict there. It's not that they're all somehow forced into the same conclusion. It's that they see that the same conclusion is the right conclusion.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And if it's a toss-up, then any and every one of them will be happy to, toss the coin.
Right. Could you describe what you call the Plenum Objection and how you might deal with that? So it has to do with God not just creating one world, but a number of different worlds.
Right. That strikes me as the most significant objection, potentially. I might preface that by noting that there's another kind of objection that is available, but would not be attractive to probably most contemporary philosophers of religion, and that is to hold a strong view about divine simplicity. The thought is that God himself in his being and each and every one of his essential properties are one and the same thing. His goodness is the same as his omnipotence, which is the same as his omniscience, which is the same as his eternity, which is the same as him, and so on. If you think that's a defensible view, then it is open to you to claim that God's uncreatedness, his aseity, as we say, is identical to all of his other properties.
And so it can't be separated.
Can't be separated. They're literally one and the same. And therefore, a perfect creature that has any one of God's essential properties would have to have aseity, but it can't because it's a creature.
Right.
Right. So that would seem to make it logically impossible for God to create perfect creatures. But other than that sort of line of thought, which, as I say, I don't think is likely to be attractive to most people, though there are some philosophers who are in interesting ways trying to rehabilitate that doctrine.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. The Plenum Objection is the worrisome one, and the Plenum Objection simply goes like this. Well, for all you know, Evan Fales, God did create perfect creatures. And, bully for him. I mean, that was a good thing to do. But why should he stop with perfect creatures? After all, there might be tons of other types of beings which are such that they're worthy of existence, and such that the world would have more value in it, right, if they did exist. Plus, you have the added benefit of variety.
Right.
Right? I mean, a perfect creature world is, after all, a little bit dull. And so why wouldn't God have created other things, including even such woebegone creatures as ourselves, in addition to the perfect creatures? Why wouldn't he have created a kind of plenum of worthwhile existence? And I don't have a decisive argument against that view, but I do have reasonably strong intuitions that it would be ill-advised for God to do that, and that it wouldn't be an improvement. First of all, because when it comes to amount of value, each of the perfect creatures has an infinite amount of value.
Right.
So, but my value is only finite. You add a finite bit to an infinite bit, what do you get?
Yeah. It's kind of trivial.
Now, that may be too simple. I mean, maybe I have and you have a kind of value that a perfect creature doesn't have. It's not commensurable with the value of a perfect creature.
Sure. It would sure seem that whatever value finite beings or a world of finite beings could bring about, it would need to be pretty darn good to justify the evils that come as a package
That's the second
deal.
point. That's the second point, is that even if there are some uniquely worthwhile goods that could only be brought about by creatures such as we, there's an awfully high price to pay for that, and God would have known that if he has foreknowledge. And why would he do that? I mean, why would he? It may even be true that in some ways there's more value in the world, more net value in the world, if he creates us than if he doesn't. But you can't say, well, it's because he wants creatures that are free, because perfect creatures are free.
Right.
Well, he wants company and things to worship him, because the perfect creatures do that. Well, he just wants things that kind of manage to get their chin above the baseline, as it were. Because what? Because he wants more variety. And I have an argument to the effect that variety for variety's sake isn't really worth the candle for a being like God, who's incapable of being bored. to begin with.
It does seem to be a kind of an anthropomorphic view there, that, attributing a capacity for boredom or for a desire for variety purely for its own sake.
Right. Besides which, it often helps to remind ourselves of the commitment that Christians have to the kingdom of God, which is almost as boring.
Yeah.
Right. At least on some depictions of it.
Yeah. I recently read a paper by Schellenberg in which he offers a logical problem of evil, and he kind of deals with some of these other goods that, the goods that you're kind of referring to, where, perhaps it's good that finite creatures exist in a context of evil, such that they can exercise virtues like sacrifice or development of moral character, for example. But he points out that if all goods are ultimately good because they are reflections of some fact about the divine, whether or not we have access to the purest form of that good, then we have to be able to say that those goods are mere tokens of a more general and pure type already found in God. And so the question is, are we willing to create a world of evil like that for mere tokens, when presumably perfect creatures are just you're going to be multiplying the purest form of those goods.
Right. I had a similar idea, which is that there is, to some extent, something that grabs our intuitions in the thought that there's a kind of real good that derives from not having your perfections handed to you on a silver platter, but having to work for them, having to struggle to gain moral maturity through some degree of trial and error and suffering and so on.
Putting forth an effort.
And watching other people suffer. But it's not true of God that he had to go through all that to get his moral perfections, and it's not true of the perfect creatures that they have to. Right. So either they are lacking some kind of a good thing, namely having had the experience of moral formation,
right?
Or they're not. And if they're not, then what's so good about our having to go through that?
Exactly. So in Anselm's argument, in more modern versions of the ontological argument, they kind of rely on a premise that necessary features are in some sense better than merely contingent features. So a necessary moral perfection is better than a merely contingently morally perfect character. And so that would seem to me to be a rather decisive response to the goodness of moral growth. Well, who needs moral growth when you are necessarily morally perfect?
Right. So. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a certain kind of foreshortened perspective that is, I guess one might say, anthropocentric here. That is, we tend to gravitate rather naturally toward virtues that we understand in the context of human life. But it's fair to say, I think, that the reason moral formation is so good is because it aims at something that we don't have without it, right? It's because it has this good result. But if you had the good result to start out with, then there wouldn't be any need for it.
Yeah, the intuition for the goodness of moral growth wouldn't exist in a world populated by purely perfect creatures. In your opinion, what do you think is the most promising or interesting, I guess take your pick, argument in the theist's toolbox?
It's a little bit like being asked, well, who's your favorite philosopher? apples and oranges.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that certainly one of the most interesting arguments or developments has been the development of sophisticated fine-tuning arguments by Robin Collins and some others. I'm open to the possibility that such arguments can be successful. My main reaction, my main response to Robin is, look, we're talking here about the results of particle physics and cosmology, which are and have been in a state of considerable flux for some time now, 50, 60, 70 years. And what people think now and what they will think 10 years from now are quite likely to be rather different stories, perhaps even fairly fundamentally different stories. We don't know. And what you're doing is to some extent holding your argument hostage to our ignorance, our ultimate ignorance about what the right story is. And so, fine. I mean, maybe the story as you are putting it forth will turn out to be more or less the right picture. And maybe if that story is right, you can get a fine-tuning argument out of it. But maybe we should just wait. Wait and see rather than quite so much, fuss and feathers over something that may be changing. Right. So that's one issue that strikes me as a really interesting one that wants to get sorted out eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For myself, my worry about fine-tuning arguments generally is that I'm not convinced that they provide evidence in addition to what the existence of moral agents already does. So I think that quite clearly the existence of moral agents in whatever form they might be would be evidence for theism. And so to that degree, I think there's some evidence for theism, but I'm not convinced that upon learning the narrow parameters that this counts as an extra boost of evidence. It's a difficult parsing of probabilities.
Yeah, I mean, there are questions here about moral arguments for the existence of God, and this is going to depend in part on what sort of view you have of moral ontology.
Yes.
Okay, I happen to have a moral ontology which doesn't have a problem per se with the existence of moral creatures in a world that doesn't have a God. But there is a problem that, actually a couple of problems that are really deep questions in metaphysics generally that are waiting in the wings. And one of these is just the mind-body problem. I think that whatever is the right story there has considerable implications for theism. And I don't think anybody really has a solution to that problem, or even really close to a solution to that problem. So that's, again, something that's kind of hanging there, over everybody's heads. And I don't know what the answer is. The other issue has to do with the way in which teleology figures in our ontological catalog of the world. I'm convinced that there are teleological facts. They're just as real as, facts like the fact that I have 10 fingers, 2 arms. And I think they are, by and large, just as accessible. We know lots of things about what the teleological organization is, especially of living organisms.
Okay.
The question is, how does that fit in to a naturalistic picture in which, we're just bags of chemicals or whatever? And, of course, there have been considerable efforts to try to reduce, in some sense, teleological facts to facts about natural facts about positive feedback systems and negative feedback systems and so on. I'm not convinced that really is successful yet either. And so there's another question that, by my lights, is important, because I think in order to get a naturalistic ethics, you need to have teleological facts.
Okay. Yeah, I've recently been converted to a kind of irreducible normative realism, and yeah, that's just a change I've made recently, where I've just had to expand in that way.
Yeah.
And it's a bizarre feeling.
As it is for theists that come to the conclusion that they have to contract.
Right.
And there is, at least in some quarters, a somewhat naive stereotype of atheists as being committed to a very narrow kind of naturalism.
Thorough reductionistic.
And thoroughly reductionistic and so on. And there certainly are such.
Yeah.
And there's some theoretical virtues to trying to see if that'll work. Right? But I and a lot of non-theists that I know are not really in that camp at all. I mean, I'm a Platonist when it comes to universals, for example. Okay. There's abstract stuff all over the place in my world, for example. And I'm a libertarian when it comes to free will, and that's not that common for atheists, or at least for naturalists.
Sure. So
but there's nothing that says...
You do consider yourself a naturalist, then?
Yes, but...
A rather liberal naturalist?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. As you know, if you're a friend of Matt's, the word naturalism is attached to many different doctrines or sins, as some people would say. I subscribe to a quite minimal naturalism, actually fairly closely akin to the way in which Al Plantinga has characterized naturalism.
That there are no such things as God?
Yeah, now what he does, he gives you a list. There are no such things as gods, and ghosts and stuff like that. I offer a general metaphysical criterion, which is to be a naturalist in my minimalist sense is to think that there aren't and arguably can't be any disembodied minds. Right. So I don't know what the story is about why minds have to be embodied, but the guess is that they do.
Yeah.
And that's enough to make you a naturalist, at least in the way I care about.
Okay. That makes sense. So setting aside specific arguments for and against theism, in your opinion, what do you think are some of the more interesting or surprising, broad developments in philosophy of religion since the kind of renaissance of the 1960s?
Well, that's a tough one too, because it's really a phenomenon. In fact, with the demise of positivism, I anticipated that something like this would happen, that Christian philosophy would no longer be considered professionally disreputable, and it would start to emerge, and it certainly has. And I suppose I would be hard pressed to pick one or two things as being really, maybe if I thought about it a while, I could come up with an answer to that question. I'm not sure I can answer it right off the bat, because there have been so many. I mean, there are areas such as modal semantics, right? And issues in the mind-body problem, and various things that interconnect with philosophy of religion, but also have their home, as it were, in other areas of philosophy that have benefited, I think, from people thinking about issues in philosophy of religion.
If you appreciate the content and the tone of what Real A Theology has to offer, please consider writing a review of the show on iTunes or contributing a modest amount per episode to the Real A Theology Patreon. The Real A Theology intro music is by Thomas Smith, with all other music by Jason Camo of A Lost State of Mind. We want to thank our patrons: Matt Smith, Lucas Stewart, Matt Yellen, Richard Kane, Jeremy Zierce, Brandon McCleary, John Danaher of the Philosophical Disquisitions blog, Andrew Snyder, Jason McLoetta, Evan Wirtz, St. Nimbus, Bob April, and Alexander Songe. Thank you for listening.